They called her the Porcelain Princess, once. Princess Ilara. The name had been a tribute to the flawless perfection of her features, the luminous quality of her skin, and the delicate grace with which she moved through the marbled halls of her father's castle. She was the kingdom's jewel, a living testament to the divine right and unblemished bloodline of King Theron. But porcelain, for all its beauty, is fragile. It shatters. And when Ilara fell, she did not merely crack, she was splintered into 1,000 pieces of her former self, and her father, the king, saw only the ruin. A riding accident, a panicked stallion, the sickening crack of a great oak branch across her back, these were the simple, brutal instruments of her unmaking. Now, her legs lay inert, beautiful but useless appendages that remembered the feel of silk sheets but had forgotten the command to stand. Her world had shrunk to the confines of a wheeled chair, a throne of polished wood and cold iron that was more cage than seat of honor. The king, a man who worshipped strength as a god and saw weakness as a contagion, could not bear the sight of her. His jewel was now a flaw, a constant, rolling reminder of imperfection in his perfect lineage. He had tried priests and physicians, mystics and charlatans, but her paralysis remained an immutable fact, a stubborn stain upon his legacy. And so, he decided to cleanse the stain. The public humiliation was orchestrated with the cold precision of a military campaign. On the day of the summer solstice, he gathered the court and the citizenry in the great square. He was to announce his new heir, a distant, robust nephew whose veins pulsed with the same supposedly vigorous blood. But first, there was a lesson to be taught. Ilara was wheeled out onto a high balcony, a solitary figure in white, the sun catching the unshed tears in her eyes and making them glitter like diamonds of grief. Her father's voice, amplified by the cruel acoustics of the stone courtyard, boomed across the silent crowd. He spoke of purity, of the demands of the crown, of a kingdom needing a symbol that could stand tall. He never once used her name. She was this unfortunate burden, this emblem of fragility, this shadow of what was he declared her unfit, not just to rule, but to even bear the royal name. With a final, dismissive wave of his hand, he pronounced her sentence. She was to be taken to the Grey Spire, a forgotten watchtower on the kingdom's farthest fringe, a place where felons and madmen were once left to the mercy of the elements. It was a pit of stone and memory, and he was throwing his daughter into it. Let her contemplate the nature of true strength in silence, he concluded, his words a death knell to the life she had known. The crowd was a sea of downturned faces, a mixture of pity, fear, and a grim sort of relief that the king's chilling gaze was not fixed on them. As the guards wheeled her away, she did not look at him. She looked at the sky, a vast, indifferent canvas of blue, and felt the last threads of her old identity tear away, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly exposed. The Grey Spire was less a dwelling and more a wound in the landscape, a jagged tooth of crumbling granite that gnawed at the sky. It stood on a windswept hill overlooking a small, huddled village that smelled perpetually of charcoal and damp earth. In that village lived a blacksmith named Cale. He was a man forged from the same elements he commanded, fire, iron, and a profound, enduring silence. His strength was not the brittle, loud authority of the king, but the quiet, resilient power of the mountains that cradled the valley. His heart, once a blazing hearth, was now banked low, embers of grief glowing dimly in the dark. A fever had swept through the village 2 winters past, and it had stolen his wife, leaving him with a silence that filled every corner of his cottage and a daughter, Lyra, whose own voice had been extinguished by the shock of the loss. The small, 6-year-old girl moved like a phantom through their lives, her eyes wide and ancient, her lips sealed. Cale's world had been reduced to the rhythmic certainty of his hammer on the anvil, a steady, lonely heartbeat in a world that had gone quiet. It was into this fragile peace that the king's men came, their polished armor a discordant note against the rustic simplicity of the village. They brought with them the disgraced princess, her wheelchair lurching over the rutted track. They were garrisoned at the spire for a week, a token guard to ensure the king's decree was seen to be done, but they were ill-supplied. Their captain, a man with a sneer permanently etched onto his face, approached Cale's forge. They needed water barrels repaired, tools sharpened, and a week's worth of iron rations. They offered a handful of coins, an insult to the work required. When Cale refused, the captain's eyes glinted with a cruel idea. He gestured back toward the spire, where Ilara's silhouette was a small, desolate shape against the grey stone. "A service to the crown, then, Smith," he said, his voice slick with contempt. "We leave in 7 days. You take charge of the package. See she doesn't wander." In exchange, the supplies, it wasn't a bargain, it was a disposal. Cale looked past the guard, his gaze finding Ilara's. He saw not a broken princess or a royal burden, but a terror and a fierce, buried dignity that resonated with the trapped spirits of his own wife and daughter. He saw a person drowning in a silence as profound as his own. Without a word, he gave a single, sharp nod of his head. The deal was struck. The transition from the spire to the forge was a journey between two separate worlds, a passage from death to a tentative chance at life. The tower had been a tomb of cold. The air, thick with the scent of mildew and rat droppings, had clung to her like a damp shroud. The wind had been a constant, mournful voice whispering through the arrow slits. Cale carried her from her chair into his cottage, his movements careful, his strength a cradle rather than a restraint. The moment she crossed the threshold, a wave of new sensations washed over her. The air was warm and alive, smelling of coal smoke, baked bread, and the faint, sweet scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The oppressive silence of the tower was replaced by the gentle crackle and hiss of a hearth fire. He placed her not on a hard bench, but in a worn, padded chair by the fire, draping a thick, woolen blanket over her useless legs. The wool was coarse against her skin, so different from the silks and velvets of her past, yet it held a warmth that felt more honest, more real, than any comfort she had ever known. That night, she heard the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the child, Lyra, from a small adjoining room, a sound of life so simple and profound it made her own heart ache with a forgotten hope. Cale treated her with a reverence that bewildered her. It was not the cloying pity of the court servants or the fearful deference she had once commanded. It was a simple, profound respect for her as a person. He spoke to her in quiet, direct sentences, asking if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, his voice a low rumble that was somehow calming. He gave her his own small room, the one with a proper bed and a small window that looked out onto a patch of hardy mountain flowers. He himself took a simple straw pallet on the floor by the ever-glowing embers of the forge, a guardian at the gates of her fragile new sanctuary. She expected cruelty, or at the very least, a resentful indifference. She received only kindness, a kindness so unexpected it felt like a foreign language she was slowly beginning to understand. It was an act of grace in a world that had shown her none, and it chipped away at the wall of ice that had formed around her heart. She did not understand his motives. She was a pariah, a danger to anyone who helped her. Why would this quiet, grieving man risk so much for a stranger? The answer came not in words, but in a silent offering. A few nights after her arrival, Cale entered the cottage to find her straining to read an old, tattered book of law she had managed to hide in the folds of her dress. By the flickering candlelight, her face was alive with concentration, the scholar and the princess she used to be shining through the veil of her despair. From the doorway of the other room, the child Lyra watched, her dark eyes filled with an intense, unreadable curiosity. Cale followed his daughter's gaze. He looked from the princess, lost in a world of words, to his daughter, trapped in a world without them. He cleared his throat, a rough, hesitant sound. "Her mother," he began, his voice thick with unshed sorrow, "she used to read to her every night." Lyra loved the stories. He paused, his gaze pleading. Perhaps you could teach her." Her letters. Something for her to hold on to in that moment, Ilara understood. He had not rescued her for a reward from the king, nor out of some abstract sense of duty. He had taken her in for his daughter. He had seen a use for the part of her that was not broken. And so, a new purpose bloomed in the ashes of her old life. She became a teacher. With a piece of charcoal and a smoothed slate Cale had prepared for her, she began to unravel the mysteries of the alphabet for the silent child. She drew pictures of dragons and griffins, of brave knights and clever queens who ruled with their wits instead of their swords. Her voice, at first thin and hesitant, grew stronger with each story, filling the small cottage with tales from a world Lyra had never known. A quiet, healing rhythm established itself. The day was measured by the clang of Cale's hammer against steel, a powerful, grounding percussion. The evenings were measured by the soft scratch of charcoal on slate and the sound of Ilara's voice weaving narratives of hope and courage. She was no longer a discarded princess waiting to die. She was a storyteller, a mentor, a necessary part of this small, wounded family. For the first time since the branch had struck her from her horse, Ilara felt useful. She felt needed. And in that feeling, she discovered the first solid ground on which to rebuild her shattered sense of self. The bridge between them was built of shared sorrow. One night, a violent storm broke over the valley, the wind howling like a banshee and the thunder cracking with a percussive force that shook the very foundations of the cottage. The sound was a key, unlocking a dark room in Ilara's memory. It sounded just like the crack of the branch that had broken her spine, the thunder of the hooves as her horse had bolted. A cold terror seized her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as the room seemed to tilt around her. Cale found her like that, a statue of panic in the flickering firelight. He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to quiet her fears. He simply knelt before her, his large, calloused hands resting on the wooden arms of her chair, providing a silent, solid anchor in the tempest of her memory. When the worst of it had passed, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper above the raging wind. He told her of the fever of holding his wife's hand as the life faded from her, of the terrible, crushing helplessness of being strong enough to bend iron but powerless to save the person he loved most. He spoke of the silence that followed, a silence that his daughter had crawled into and never left. In the heart of the storm, they laid their broken pieces before each other, and in the shared geography of their pain, they found a profound and unbreakable bond. Later that night, the storm's fury found a weakness in the thatched roof. A steady drip of cold water began to fall, landing inches from Ilara's chair. Cale moved to push her to a drier spot. As he took hold of the chair, his hand brushed against hers where it rested on the arm. It was a simple, accidental touch, skin against skin, but it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated warmth through her entire body. It was not a touch of pity or of duty, it was a touch of connection, human and real. She looked up at him, and he was already looking at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, his expression one of startled discovery. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The storm outside roared, a wild symphony that mirrored the sudden, unexpected storm that had broken loose inside their own hearts. The moment stretched, fraught with unspoken questions and terrifying new possibilities, before he finally looked away, his cheeks flushed, and finished moving her chair. But the spark had been struck. Lyra, in her innocence, became the architect of their deepening affection. She was the silent messenger between their two guarded worlds. She began leaving small offerings for Ilara, a smooth, grey stone from the riverbed, a vibrant wildflower, a perfectly formed bird's feather. She started to sit at Ilara's feet during the lessons, her small hand occasionally resting on Ilara's knee. And one afternoon, as Ilara was patiently sounding out a word, Lyra leaned forward and whispered a faint, breathy "ah," a perfect echo of the sound. The shared look of astonishment and joy that passed between Ilara and Cale in that moment was more intimate than any embrace. They became a team, moving in a comfortable, unspoken domestic rhythm. Their hands would brush as he passed her a bowl of stew, their eyes would meet over Lyra's bent head as she painstakingly drew a letter on the slate. Their love story was not one of grand declarations, but one written in the quiet language of shared glances, gentle gestures, and the mutual, fierce protection of the small, silent girl who was the heart of their home. But the world beyond their small haven of healing would not leave them in peace. A whisper campaign began in the village, fueled by fear of the king. The blacksmith was consorting with the outcast. He was inviting royal displeasure upon them all. Soon, the whispers turned into a wall of silence. No one brought horses to be shod, no one came to have ploughs mended. Cale's work, the lifeblood of their small family, dried up. The rumors eventually reached the ears of Lord Valerus, the king's regional steward, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. He saw an opportunity to curry favor with his monarch. He arrived at the forge one afternoon with 2 armed guards, his silks and perfumes a vile offense in the honest air of the smithy. He sneered at the sight of Ilara by the hearth, at the royal bloodline, as he called it, living in soot and squalor. Treason, he hissed at Cale. Harboring a declared pariah is an act against the crown. For a moment, Cale stood frozen, the spectre of the king's wrath a tangible thing in the small cottage. But then, a voice cut through the tension, clear and cold as ice. It was Elara. She had been observing, her mind, sharpened by years of royal education, analyzing the situation. "Lord Valerus," she said, her voice devoid of fear, ringing with an innate authority he could not ignore. "You will find in the royal statutes, section 12, that even those cast out by decree are entitled to the king's provision for basic sustenance. As Mr. Cale is providing such, he is not harboring a traitor, but fulfilling a duty the crown itself has neglected." Valerus was stunned into silence, his legal footing completely swept from under him by a crippled girl in a peasant's cottage. He retreated, sputtering threats, but the immediate danger had been deflected by the sharpest of weapons, her mind. Though he had been momentarily thwarted, Valerus was a vengeful man. He enacted his revenge not with a sword, but with starvation. He placed an embargo on the entire village, cutting off all trade and supplies from the capital, blaming their defiance. Days turned into a week, and the pinch of hunger became a gnawing ache. The fire in the hearth burned low, and the larder was nearly bare. One evening, the three of them sat in a near darkness broken only by the faint glow from the forge. The despair in the room was a physical weight. Cale looked at Elara, his face a mask of anguish. "I am sorry for this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have brought you from one prison to another." She reached across the space between them, her hand finding his. It was calloused and strong, yet it trembled slightly in her grasp. "No," she said, her voice fierce and unwavering. "You gave me back my life, Cale. Before I came here, I was in a pit far deeper and darker than any tower." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the dam of his carefully controlled emotions finally broke. "I think," he confessed, the words torn from the deepest part of him, "I think I am falling in love with you." Elara, a single tear traced a path through the soot on her cheek. "I believe," she answered softly, her grip tightening on his hand, "I already have." In that moment of absolute desperation, their love became not just a comfort, but an act of rebellion, their final, unassailable fortress. Fueled by this new strength, Elara's mind began to work, searching the archives of her memory for a different kind of weapon. She remembered her studies, the long hours spent with tutors on the dry subject of civic law and ancient charters. And then she found it, a glimmer of hope in a dusty corner of the past. 2 centuries prior, a benevolent king had granted this very village a specific charter, rewarding their loyalty. The charter gave them unique rights, including the right to bypass local governance and appeal directly to the royal council if their trade and livelihood were unjustly threatened. Valerus's embargo was not just cruel, it was illegal. It was a flagrant violation of an immutable royal decree. They had a path, a narrow, treacherous one, but a path nonetheless. They needed allies. Cale, for all his reclusiveness, was a man of deep integrity. The villagers, now sharing his fate of starvation, remembered. They remembered the times he had mended a widow's pot for free, or allowed a farmer to pay for a new plough blade with a portion of his future harvest. His quiet decency had planted seeds of loyalty that were now ready to be harvested. They went first to the priory at the edge of the village, to Father Michael, a wise old priest with eyes that saw the truth of a person's soul. Elara, with Cale by her side, laid out her plan, not as a princess demanding fealty, but as a scholar presenting a legal and moral argument. The priest listened, his gaze shifting from Elara's sharp, intelligent face to Cale's unwavering one. He saw not a scandal, but an injustice. He agreed to help them draft the official petition, his hand lending the weight of the faith to their cause. When word spread of the charter and the priest's support, the villagers, who had once shunned them, rallied. Fear gave way to a desperate, defiant hope. They did not march on the capital, that would have been rebellion. They chose a wiser path. Father Michael himself carried the petition, a scroll that was both a plea for justice and a brilliant legal indictment of Lord Valerus. As fate would have it, King Theron was away, touring the northern territories to display his robust nephew and heir. The petition landed not before the king, but before the royal council, which was being temporarily presided over by the king's cousin, a man known for his adherence to law rather than ego. The council could not ignore the ancient charter. It was law. They were forced to summon Lord Valerus to answer for his actions. And as the primary witness, the author of the complaint, they also summoned Princess Ilara. She did not travel to the capital. Instead, she dictated her testimony to Father Michael, a masterpiece of logic and rhetoric that laid bare Valerus's tyranny, and by subtle extension, the cold and careless cruelty of the king who had fostered such men. The fallout was swift and decisive. Faced with the undeniable evidence of the charter and Ilara's irrefutable testimony, the council stripped Lord Valerus of his title and lands. He was disgraced, his ambition undone by a law he had been too arrogant to know and a woman he had been too foolish to underestimate. The news reached King Theron on his tour, a public humiliation that fractured his carefully crafted image of absolute authority. He had been outmaneuvered by his broken, discarded daughter. To act against her now would be to admit defeat and appear a petty tyrant in the eyes of his own council. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, left impotent and fuming, a mirror of the powerlessness he had once inflicted upon her. In the aftermath, the royal council, in an act of contrition, sent a message to Ilara. They offered her a quiet life at a remote country estate, a generous pension, a gilded cage to replace her stone one. She refused without a moment's hesitation. Her place was not in the world that had cast her out. Her place was here. She chose the soot and the fire, the scent of baking bread and the steady rhythm of the hammer. She chose Kale. When they returned to the village, they were no longer outcasts. They were heroes. The villagers, their livelihood restored, greeted them with cheers. Kale's forge became the heart of the community, busier than it had ever been, his honor and skill now legendary. Their small cottage was no longer a shelter, it was a home, their own small kingdom built on a foundation of courage and love. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the sky in hues of rose and gold, Kale lifted a sleeping Ilara from her chair to carry her to bed. It had become their ritual, an act of quiet intimacy that spoke more than words ever could. Lyra, who had been sitting by the fire, stood up and watched them. Her expression was one of profound contemplation. She looked at Ilara's peaceful face, nestled against her father's strong shoulder, and then she looked at her father. She took a small step forward, pointed a tentative finger at the sleeping princess, and spoke. Her first word. It was not a mamad orth papa. It was a word clear as a silver bell in the quiet cottage, a word born of all she had seen and understood. Queen, she whispered. It was not a title of rank or power. It was a coronation of the heart, a recognition of the true royalty that resided not in a bloodline, but in a spirit that had refused to be broken. For true nobility is not a birthright, but a quality of the soul, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by compassion. A true crown is not made of gold or jewels, but of the unwavering dignity one wears in the face of despair. And a true kingdom is not a fortress of cold, imposing stone, but a humble home, no matter how small, whose walls are built with kindness, whose hearth is warmed by love, and whose gates are always open to the lost and the broken, offering them a place to finally heal and become whole.